Bill Maynard, Vice Chair of the ICAO Meteorology Panel, and meteorologist and an aviation safety inspector. I invite you to join me in Montreal this December for GANIS 2, the second Global Air Navigation Industry Symposium. Together, industry and state representatives will build a common vision and set goals for an improved and seamless global aviation system. The outcome of GANIS 2 will be a key consideration for the 13th Air Navigation Conference in October 2018, where key milestones will be set. Meteorological services are undergoing fundamental changes and improvements to provide both safety and efficiency benefits. We can, today, provide a tremendous amount of high-quality weather information at a high resolution in both time and space and tailor it to flight-specific planning and decision-making requirements. Going forward, we must provide exactly what is needed, exactly when it is needed, in the most straightforward and cost-effective manner possible. Your participation at the GANIS 2 meteorology session will help us cooperatively define future requirements. It will be an excellent opportunity to strengthen the dialogue between those who use weather information and those who supply it. The meteorological panel team will be there, and we will be listening carefully to your views. I hope to see you there.
Everybody, if you could come in and take a seat, please. It's 9 o'clock. We want to get started. All right, so while the last few people come in and find seats, I want to start off again just welcoming everybody back in. I hope you had a wonderful evening and have renewed your energy for today, because we have quite an exciting panel to start things off. We're going to get into much more of the nuts and bolts of the RPAS program today. So yesterday we had a lot of background information to provide context to the RPAS developments. Today we turn our attention to the next steps for regulators and training facilities. The information is equally important for operators and individuals who who want to become or already are remote pilots. We will start with learning about competency-based training, what it is and why it is essential for the industry. We then put it in context by discussing this with current operators and trainers. Following that discussion, we'll have a look at the licensing authority and the impact on them of implementing competency-based training and assessment within their state. This transition will raise many questions and concerns for those licensing authorities. Finally, we will bring all these pieces together in a session that looks at the context from the perspective of the operator. After all, it's the RPAS operator who is responsible for the safe, secure, and efficient planning and conduct of each and every operation. So before I introduce our moderator for the next two sessions, I just want to do a quick recap of how questions can come in as well as the RPAS app. So, questions can be submitted to the moderator via email, plenary@icao.int. We'll put this slide up periodically for anybody who was not here yesterday and made note of this. The other thing is we have an app for this symposium. The program is on the app and a lot of information. We strongly urge everybody download the app and make use of it. So with that, let's get started with today's sessions. Our first one is on the competency-based training and assessment. For this, I have the privilege to introduce Mr. Farid Zizi as the moderator. I had the privilege of working with Farid for several years while he served in the Air Navigation Commission. So I recruited him back to help us with this event. Farid Zizi is Scientific Advisor, International Affairs in the French DGAC. Previously, as I said, he served as an Air Navigation Commissioner here at ICAO, where he held the position of President of the body from 2014 to 16. And he was key in the development of the competency-based framework for air traffic management professionals. So now that this is expanding on to remote pilots, well, we already have some understanding of how to do that. Farid.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for inviting me. It will be a long day, beginning with how the word competency. I don't want to enter in any definition of the competencies because we never agreed on the definition. And as you heard yesterday, definitions in ICAO are always a nightmare. But yesterday you heard about performance standards, you heard about risk-based approach, you heard about a number of things which are how to regulate in keeping flexibility. And in terms of training, competency-based training is a bit of that, or everything of that. So what we will try to do is to make you understand competency-based training. That's the purpose of the first session. Second one will be to confront that understanding to the operation world, the challenges of the operations and of the operators. And then we'll go slowly to the licensing authorities to finish back with the operators. So that's the scenario for today. How many of you know about competency-based training in the room? Good. Good. Let's see if we have the same understanding of what it is. Okay. Without waiting further, I'd like to introduce Ashley Lauryssen, who is a senior training expert at EUROCONTROL Institute. With Ashley and Nicole, The three of us contribute a lot to the ATC and ATSEP competency framework in ICAO, which was published in the PANS training. So that's I don't want to call it the dream team, but at least the two madams here are the dream team, the real dream team. So she will put you in, let's say, in good shape with the principles of competency-based training. Ashley, you have the floor. Yeah, it is.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. When you think of, say, pilot training, an image comes to mind. It might be something like this. When you think of air traffic control training, an image comes to mind. When you think of remote pilot training, well, actually there are a number of images that come to mind. When you think of competency-based training, an image? Well, an image doesn't come to mind. And in fact, that's part of the problem. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes trying to fill this blank space. This is John. He's a trainee approach controller, and he's been at his unit now for about the last 5 months training. How do you know when John is competent? When is he ready to do this job on his own? Do you decide that John is competent because he's able to perform all the tasks of the approach controller? Is that enough? Is it because he's done about 200 hours of on-the-job training and he's passed all his theory exams? Or is it because in the collective opinion of your instructors, John's ready? And this question, how do you know when John is ready to do the job on his own, brings us one of the most important messages that comes out of a competency-based approach. You need to first define what competency is before you can decide if John is competent. In simple terms, you need to know what it is that you're looking for. Which I guess does really beg the question, well, what does competent performance look like? And this is where ICAO and their air traffic controller competency framework comes into the picture, because it provides us with the starter kit that we need to work out what John's competent performance is going to look like. And it provides us with a list of competencies that can be applied to all controllers and in fact across all of the ratings. And this is what the list looks like. It then provides us with additional information that will help us to work out what we will observe, what we will see when these competencies are being performed in the way that they should be. But please bear in mind, this is just a starter kit. In fact, these competencies and their observable behaviors, they're quite generic, and you will need to adapt them to your local environment. And to emphasize this point, I'd like to get back to John again, because when John eventually validates, he's going to be providing approach control services to this relatively busy aerodrome. However, his best friend Natalie, she's also a trainee approach controller. When she validates, she's going to be providing approach control services to this somewhat different aerodrome. Do both John and Natalie need the same competencies to do their respective jobs? The answer to that question is yes. They do need the same competencies. They both need to be able to manage their traffic. And they both need to be able to separate traffic to manage their workload, to communicate effectively, and so on. But in John's case, for him to perform competently, he's going to be carrying out this really narrow range of tasks. But he's going to be doing so in a highly complex environment with dense traffic, where the standards for efficiency are going to be extremely demanding. While in Natalie's case, she's pretty much, well, she's out there on her own. So for her to perform competently, she's going to carry out a much, much wider range of tasks. But given that location and given that context, possibly the standards for efficiency aren't going to be as demanding. And for sure, she's going to be doing some tasks that are radically different to John. So clearly, John and Natalie's training is not going to be the same because the conditions that they're operating under, well, they're different. And the standards that they need to achieve, they're not the same either. But at the end of the day, they both need to achieve the same competencies. Now, the ATC competency framework is found in ICAO PANS training. And this document helps us to get to grips with how you can use this framework to create efficient competency-based training. And it explains how you adapt the framework to create your local competency-based training that is appropriate for your regulatory, your operational, and your technical environment, and that delivers up controllers or operators that are competent to do the job in your specific context. You know, after John finished his initial training at the ATC College, he very proudly arrives at his unit to start his on-the-job training. And on the first day, he sits down to start the shift, and the instructor walks over to him and taps him on the shoulder. And John turns to the instructor, who's standing there, and says to John, he says, "John, as of today, I want you to forget everything that you learned in the college. Because today, you're starting with the real job, and I'm going to be the one to show you how to do it." And sadly, John's story is not that uncommon in our aviation domain. And you know, training costs a lot of money. You'd really expect every single training hour to count. But still, you can get this disconnect between what is being taught in an ADC college and what a student really needs to know in order to be able to do the operational job. And this is where a competency-based approach can help us, because that local competency model that you create, you can and you should be using it for the initial training of your students, and that same model can be used for training the student when they arrive at their unit, and even better still, that model can be used for the refresher training of your already qualified and experienced controllers. Why? Because those competencies that you decided were relevant for your environment, they don't change. The conditions and the standards are what vary from phase to phase of training. So let's get back to John and his training. He's training at a unit that hasn't heard of competency-based training. So they don't have a local competency model. And John is really struggling to get this picture in his mind about what his performance is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to be. And to make matters worse, he's now having problems with his instructors. They're good enough people, of course, but they all seem to be telling him slightly different things about what it is that he should be doing. So on one day, John arrives for the shift, and his instructor says to him, "John, you're young, you're inexperienced. So when you manage your arrival sequences, I want you to create a safety buffer for yourself. I want you to add an extra mile between each of the aircraft on final approach. And in that way, if things go wrong, if you make a mistake, you've given yourself room to maneuver and you're keeping the traffic safe." And so that's exactly what John does. He manages his arrival sequences, adding in the safety buffer. The following morning, he arrives for another shift, and he has a new instructor. No problem. On the first arrival sequence that he manages, he adds his safety buffer, his extra 1 mile. And the new instructor is sitting there tearing his hair out. He's horrified. And he says to John, "You're wasting airspace. We're going to have to tighten up your sequencing. And man, the focus is going to have to be on you becoming more efficient." In a situation like this, John can't win. The problem is that the instructors don't have the local competency model either. So even with the very best of intentions, their instructing is being based purely on their experience and their subjective opinion of what it is that they think that John is capable of. And this is one of the absolute gems about a competency-based approach, because when everyone, the students, the instructors, and the assessors, when they all have the same picture in their mind about what competent performance is, then the training becomes extremely focused. It becomes highly relevant to the job that the person is doing. And probably for John, most importantly, it becomes consistent, because all of the instructors are chasing the same goal and they're using the same criteria to do so. So John still struggles through his training. And at some point, someone in the unit is going to have to decide if John is competent to work alone. Now, if he's working at one of those units that's decided to go for the one shot, the kind of final make or break checkout, to decide if John is competent, then I can assure you that in the days, if not the weeks, leading up to that checkout, this is pretty much how John's going to be feeling, because he knows that his career is resting on this one opportunity to prove that he can do the job. And you know what? Under those circumstances, I'm just not convinced that you're going to get John's best performance. But even if he does manage to pass, can you be absolutely certain that he's competent and that he didn't just get lucky on that day? You see, in a competency-based environment, you need not only the confidence, you need the proof that John is able to perform reliably and consistently. And to get that proof, you would need to observe John many times before you make that decision. Are you hinting that I need to finish?
No. That's the automat who said it. The remote piloting.
However, the story does have a happy ending. So John does go on to validate, and in fact he controls for many years. But even when he stops controlling and he becomes the training manager at his unit, it still bothers him enormously that his training had been so unnecessarily difficult, and he really did believe that there had to be a better way to train controllers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that competency-based training is that better way, but not only for training air traffic controllers, for training many of our aviation professionals, including the training of remote pilots. And so I return to where I started, and I hope that the next time you hear these words, competency-based training, it's not this image that comes to mind. I hope that it's this image. Because you're looking at the generation of students who are going to benefit from being trained in a competency-based environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ashley. I imagine that now you are all competent on competency-based training, and this is really good. Because now that you have understood, we'll try to understand ICAO strategy towards competency-based training. And I have the privilege to welcome Nicole Barrette, whose bio begins with retired after 33 years here in ICAO, dealing, I knew Nicole few decades ago on Trainer, and then working on the flight crew licensing and working with various competency frameworks in various domains like the controllers, air traffic, ADCEPs, medical examiners, aeronautical information personals, and safety inspectors. So Nicole, the floor is yours.
Merci. Comment ça marche? Par là?
Yeah.
Merci, Farid. I'm going to say it feels good to be back home, but it's not quite home still, but it's good to be here. Thank you, Leslie, for the opportunity. So I'm going to tell you stuff that you can forget very quickly, but it just will give you background in terms of how all of these competency provisions came into our documentation, our ICAO provisions. So I don't know how familiar you are with the workings of ICAO, about our general assemblies, our annexes, our standards, etc. But we have assemblies every 3 years. And in September 2013, we held the 38th session of the general, of the assembly, of ICAO assembly. And during assemblies, we adopt resolutions. And in these resolutions, we put principles and policies that will drive the work of the organization in the coming triennium. And there was a particular resolution that was adopted in 2013, and it deals with the competency-based approach. And basically, ICAO decided that all the initiatives related to training in ICAO would be driven by a competency-based approach. Now, resolutions in ICAO generally are adopted after work has already been going on for several years. So it kind of officializes and formalizes some of that work. And that was the case with competencies. So you had a great explanation. Ashley gave a wonderful explanation and description of what competencies are and what competency-based training and assessment is. But that's now. It took a while in ICAO to get to that understanding of what competencies are. That competencies are not only about what you do, the tasks you perform, but how you do them in a specific context. So transforming that into ICAO provisions took some time. So this is, I'm just going to tell you what happened in ICAO. You can ignore it after this presentation, no worries. But there's some interesting lessons to be learned here about how an understanding can evolve. And this was an interesting process, for me anyway. So in 2000, a group of pilot training experts got together. Actually, I think some of the people who were in that Madrid meeting, some of them are here in this room. And they got together at that time to discuss how the training standards in Annex 1 in the ICAO provisions still made sense for pilot training, and if they were actually an obstacle to contemporary methodologies and training tools, or if there's something we could do to upgrade or update these provisions. A prevailing idea at that time, remember we're in 2000, was that the training programs should not be driven by the achievement of prescribed number of hours or limited number of maneuvers in the same context all the time, but they should be driven by a pilot, in this case, achieving consistently good performance. So ICAO established a panel. It's a group of experts that got together. It was called the Flight Crew Training and Licensing Panel. And this panel was tasked with looking at those things. And among other things, it created the multi-crew pilot license, which was the first competency, no, I'll do this with competency. You'll see me do this, and you'll understand why. The first competency-based license in our provisions. So what is a competency? We tried to answer that for the provisions in the years leading to the adoption of the MPL standards. And at that time, the definition of competency was it's a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes required to support the performance of tasks to specific standards. So if you look at the MPL competency framework that is in the books right now, and by the way, we're working on modifying it, but if you look at this version that's in the PANS training now, what you'll see is a description of tasks by phases of flight. Farid mentioned it earlier on. Okay, so we had that particular understanding of what competencies are. A few years later, ICAO adopted a provision related to, for pilots again, for recurrent training in flight simulation training devices. And that provision is called evidence-based training. I believe, Tim, you're going to speak to that. One of the prevailing ideas of EBT is that recurrent training for airline pilots should focus on providing them with the ability to deal with black swans, these unforeseen, unscripted, completely coming from left field kinds of situations where flight crews have to innovate and have to create a solution. That's not scripted, that's not in procedures. So to do that, they needed competencies. But these competencies didn't look like the one for the MPL. So we had a little problem in ICAO. We had two sets of provisions dealing with a competency-based approach for pilots, but with two different understanding of what is a competency. In the meantime, because we like to complicate our lives in ICAO, I can say that now. In the meantime, we were also working with controllers and trying to define the competency framework for them. And when you looked at the competencies, you saw a list that Ashley showed you, it looked very much like, it was much closer to the ones in evidence-based training. And also in the meantime, we were working on coming up with a new definition of what is a competency and what are competency frameworks, ICAO competency frameworks, and we were supporting Leslie and the RPAS panel on the work on Annex 1 and the provisions for remote pilots. So what I want to do in the next few slides is just give you an idea of what's in the PANS training document. I'm not going to go into any details. I think you can access that document and read it for yourself. And if you have any questions, you go to Leslie. So I'm just going to go through them very quickly. So let's go to the definition first. So this is now the definition of what a competency is. That's what's in ICAO, and eventually that's going to be in Annex 1. So it's a dimension of human performance that is used to reliably predict successful performance on the job. So what you want to identify is this thing, this dimension, that's going to allow you to say, okay, I consistently see this performance, and that tells me that down the road, when those unforeseen situations happen, this person will be able to perform effectively. So a competency is manifested through behaviors. I see that you're competent by the way you behave. But in order to behave a certain way, you need to know certain things, you need to have certain skills, you need to have a certain attitude. So you invoke these things while you're performing a particular task in specific conditions. There's also a description in PANS training of what competency-based training is. There's a lot more than that. There's a lot more detail, but roughly this is what the description is. So training is obviously aimed at developing competencies, but it's targeting a given function. So it's a competency framework for a remote pilot, it's a competency framework for an air traffic controller, it's a competency framework for an ADSET, etc. And competency-based assessment is based on multiple observations that competencies are demonstrated while performing tasks in context. So you heard Ashley describe how that one assessment event is really probably not a reflection of the competence of a candidate. What are the benefits of competency-based training? We also describe those in more detail in the PANS training. But an interesting idea is that it goes beyond minimum standards. Yes, so there's a minimum requirement, which is the classic way that we do provisions in ICAO. It's a more prescriptive approach, but it goes beyond that. It allows you to continuously develop, continuously learn. It prepares you for the unpredictable. It's tied, as I mentioned before, to the job and the context, and it's about learning, not passing a test. So you're not getting trained so you can make that check right and you tick all the boxes. You're getting trained so you can perform effectively and safely. In the PANS training, you'll see this process. It's a fairly classic instructional systems design process, an ADDIE process. For those of you who are familiar with training design, and we describe all these different workflows of the design process, but we really focus more on the first two processes, workflow 1 and workflow 2. I apologize for this slide. It's very small. You can look at it later on, but what I want to describe to you very briefly is how workflow, the outputs of workflow 1 and workflow 2. So workflow 1 is about, the output of workflow 1 is the development of training specifications. So basically, in your own RPL operations, you're describing in very detailed way. I was going to say you take a snapshot, but it's more than a snapshot. You're describing what you expect your remote pilot to do within the constraints of the technical, the organizational, the operational requirements. You look at the tasks that these pilots are going to perform, and on the side you have the ICAO competency framework. So now you have a clear picture of what it is you expect the remote pilot to do. That's the output of workflow 1. You feed that into workflow 2, where you're going to develop your adapted competency model. So you heard Ashley say before that the ICAO competency framework is your starter kit. That's exactly right. So it's your starting point. You look at your training specification, you look at the ICAO competency framework, and you adapt that framework so it suits your operation. So, is there a competency that's missing? You can add it in. Is there a competency that doesn't make sense for your operation? You can take it out. Are there observable behaviors that make sense or not? You can adapt it so it works for you. You also have to add in for your adapted competency model the standards to which you want to see these behaviors performed, these competencies performed, and the context, the conditions under which these are going to be performed. So that's one output of workflow 2. The task list, the more details, task list is going to be helping you to develop your training plan. And the combination of the training plan with your adapted competency model is going to help you develop your assessment plan. So, how do we link competencies to licensing? Well, basically, a license can be issued when the required competencies and their associated performance criteria that are in your adapted competency model have been demonstrated to the satisfaction of the licensing authority. So these are the competency. This is a competency framework for the remote pilots. Again, I won't, go into detail into this one. You'll see competencies that are application of procedures, communication, flight path management, leadership and teamwork, problem solving, situational awareness, workload management, coordination, and handover. So remote piloted aircraft systems provide a nice challenge for the development of provided a great challenge for ICAO provisions to be developed because components are not, for the RPAS, they're not co-located. There's a wide range of aircraft categories and types, and a wide range of types of operations. So let's look at a couple of examples for potential RPL license holders. So there's Joe. And he flies airplanes, RPAS airplanes, and he's A1 category. He uses a remote pilot station that's non-mobile, and he does instrument flight rules and short hauls. So the license needs to connect all those pieces and needs to be endorsed to accommodate that particular profile. Let's look at Pat's profile. So she flies an A3 type of airplane. She flies an R2 rotor. She can fly them with a console, with a mobile station. She can fly these types of operations. All of those things need to be connected and through her particular license. It should be endorsed, I guess is the word I'm looking for, to accommodate all of this. So it makes sense to go competency-based given the range of RPAS operation that we're dealing with. Competency-based approach to licensing is better adapted to the diversity and the evolution of RPAS operations. RPAS operators and approved training organization can determine the performance they want to see. And competency-based training is based on the outcome of training. And so you can continuously improve the program. So the ICAO competency-based approach to remote pilot training and assessment supports the flexibility, the scalability, and the complexity of RPAS operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. As you have understood, competency-based training is adaptable to a few various environments, and even for air traffic controllers or ADCEPs where you have various qualifications, you can have a unique competency framework for different qualifications. And another key notion that I want you to capture is that you are trained to perform. You are not trained to pass a test. And that's key in the competency framework. The last ones I want to remember from those two presentations is that you look at the performance through observable behaviors in a level that is objectively shared in between the definition of the framework, the student, the assessor. And that's key, is to share the same idea of what the competency is. But now we will enter with Timothy Schoenauer in another question. He will explain you, Timothy is from CAE, Global MPL leader on ab initio training for pilots. He has always also been a licensing inspector at the CAA, and 2 decades of experience in training pilots and providing pilot training solution. What is interesting, and I'd like to be alert, you to be alert in his presentation, is the relation between EBT and CBT, which is a bit of a beginning of the discussion we may have on operational feedback towards competency-based training. Tim, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour. Hope everyone is well. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm here to try and summarize multi-crew pilot license and EBT training in a very short period of time, so please work with me. CAE, as a background, has over 70 years of aviation training, primarily focused on 3 different divisions: the civil aviation training, medical services, as well as defense and security training. In 2000, we transitioned from just a device company and transitioned into pilot services and consulting services in aviation. For me, of course, one footprint does not work for all, and that's what today's discussion is about, is competency-based training, and how each individual aviation training program that's designed for remotely piloted air vehicles, as well as any competency-based training framework for MPL or EBT, must be customized. Based on really the location, the geography, the complexity of the aircraft system that's being operated, all of those elements play into the design of that training program. PANS training, as identified before in ICAO Doc 9868, gives an idea on an ISD process, but it truly has to be customized for what works for your operation. As explained previously, there's been an evolution in competency-based training here in ICAO. It really started off with the recurrent cycle training of ATQP programs, which identified a 3-year process for recurrent training for commercial aviation pilots. Then we had transition to FOQA data, which is flight operations quality assurance data, where you're getting live flight data from the aircraft itself. That gave operators the opportunity to actually take a look at different phases of flight and evaluate and assess and also mitigate risk on certain profiles, which could be unstabilized approaches, for example. So taking a look at the actual aircraft data, backing that up with safety reports, and truly the maturity of an SMS system had evolved the FOQA data into modern competency training programs. Then MPL for ab initio or initial flight training, EBT for recurrent training programs, which we'll get into in just a minute, and then most recently UPRT or upset prevention recovery training, which addresses the loss of control in flight incidents that are happening on modern, very sophisticated aircraft systems. Where it all starts, though, in my opinion, is the foundation. The foundation of really selecting the right candidate for your remotely piloted air vehicle operation. Just like a training program, I believe that selecting the right person and that profile of what that applicant looks like and candidate looks like is extremely important to get right at the beginning. As identified before, training is extremely expensive, and to embark upon that journey and then have training disruptions, it requires a continual investment in that person until finally a very difficult decision is made, aptitude is not assured, and the person washes out. So making sure that you have an adaptable pilot training screening process at the beginning is extremely important. Using sophisticated and modern tools such as symbiotics, which assess the psychomotor skills, the psychological assessment of this pilot, their practical application and possibly a simulator assessment, and even through teamwork exercises to see how they're going to cooperate and communicate with other pilots and other support functions of remotely piloted aircraft systems. So it truly is critical that the foundation is strong when you're trying to hire the right person and then design the right training program for you. So for MPL, which is an ab initio training program, we take pilots from really zero time and put them into the right seat of a transport category aircraft. That could be CRJ or something smaller, regional jet, or it could be a wide-body aircraft such as 777 or 747. So here again is a direct correlation that RPAS operations have to be, the training program has to be specific to the actual operation, geography, environment, and aircraft system that you're designing this program for. In MPL, we have 4 phases: core, basic, intermediate, and advanced. You can call it 1, 2, 3, and 4. For the most part, you can separate that for general understanding into flight school stuff for the first 2 phases, and then advanced aircraft operations in the destination airplane that they'll be flying for the intermediate and advanced phases. For the most part, the heavy lifting, the training is done in the first 3 phases, core, basic, intermediate, and then we do validation training in the advanced phases. So we were talking about how do you assess competence, how do you gauge whether this person is ready for their role as they embark upon it. It's a slow climb up a long hill of competence. It's not just one check ride that's passed, it's an assessment that's continued throughout the entire training program, and that's extremely important. In that validation phase in advanced, we're even able to use actual line captains and take them with a trainee and a loft scenario, a line-oriented flight scenario in the sim. From A to B, something goes wrong in between, and then that crew uses the reinforced decision-making models, such as 4DEC and the other formal decision-making models that are out there, to apply a safe outcome to that flight. As a course comparison, not in necessarily efficiency, but primarily in quality, as well as the just going from the known to the unknown in regarding a frozen HPL program versus an MPL program, the theory is at the front half of that training program. So the traditional 14 subjects for EASA, for example, or different compliance elements for different authorities around the world. Then what's inside that MPL gray line there is truly what is the entire training program itself. And the difference is really when the end of those 2 light gray lines finish. In a frozen HPL program, it's primarily based on achieving prescriptive hour requirements. And it culminates then, of course, with a final check ride. In the MPL program, everything is combined into that gray line. So we have all 4 phases in that gray line. You have multi-crew, 3/4 of the way through it, halfway through core is all multi-crew coordination, SOPs, scan flows, what they're actually going to use online. You also then have over 100 hours of the total 250-ish. Minimum ICAO requirement is 240. Most programs are written to 270. Is actually time on that final device. So the analogy with MPL is if you're going to be a professional truck driver for the rest of your life, spend more time driving trucks and the specific truck that you're going to drive than driving cars or something else that's not as relevant. So by making your training program as relevant and practical as possible in an RPAS environment, I think you'll find your outcomes, your success rates, and your resilience of these pilots a lot better. So how do we do this? In summary, there's really 2 main principles, which isn't revolutionary or anything, but it does work. And that's really to reduce distracted learning, particularly with English as a second language for many of these students, to remove and isolate the training elements into blocks. And then that building block foundation, which has been successful around the world by isolating those training elements. So one course in particular that we find a lot of success with is the communications practical course. As you can kind of see on the screen, it's actually an ATC training simulated software program that we use. This is an 8-week course, just as a model. And what it does, it takes these trainees and it explains to them, first of all, how do we pick up ATIS? Well, you go to a Jeppesen chart or a Lido chart. Well, what's the plan view, the profile view? Then how do you pick up your clearance? And then how do you pick up your departure clearance? Then your actual en route instructions, declaring an emergency, all via a proper ICAO phraseology. So this practical application of how to actually interact with ATC is conducted before that pilot ever takes the flight controls, before they're distracted with all the buttons and systems and knobs of the aircraft, and gives them a tremendous amount of situational awareness behind the scenes because of the indirect learning that's a result of this program. They have now a mental picture of what it looks like for ATC and what their aircraft looks like as they're flying around, as well as how to interact and reply as an aircraft in a real life scenario. There's basically 2 rows of students. There's about 7 students in the room, and as you can see at the front, there's an instructor that's acting as ATC, giving different instructions at the same time. So very practical application of communications. Then again, before they actually touch an aircraft, and I think this is extremely relevant for remote pilot air vehicles, what you see in the background is not a fancy full flight sim, it's not even a certified device, it's just a basic flying course device. So spending time learning just the basics, the fundamentals of flying, fundamentals of flight, basic attitude instrument flying, so that this pilot has a solid understanding of how aerodynamics and that theory actually applies in real life. I've seen this program. It's really about the system design. It's about the IP that's in this program, where it talks about self-assessment, preparedness for the lessons themselves, memorizing pitch power tables, coming in prepared and engaged really to learn in this session. I've seen this course be able to deliver someone who was in a third world country that came as an assessment for this program, had never been on an escalator before in his life, and within 2 hours of this course was able to land a 10-knot crosswind in this device. So through this process, again, that training program, which is very carefully scripted, over about 10 years worth of training program and development, is a very successful key in that building block of learning. So in summary, some high notes for MPL. It is absolutely a competency-based training program. The ISD is completely customized to the operation, and it has to be, right? You operate very sophisticated remotely piloted vehicles. It can't be one size fits all. It has to be unique to your operation. It can be scalable to extremely sophisticated aircraft and also down to very simple airframes. And it's not a task-based scenario. It's absolutely competency-based. So taking more scenarios and loft scenarios, line-oriented flight training scenarios, that's where you're really going to build, in my opinion, the resilience of that pilot. Putting them into situations where they have to think beyond the normal profile, but applying the decision-making process time and time again, and using those pilot competencies effectively is where you'll gain the resilience. You'll also have financial benefits because of lack of incidents or accidents on those very expensive vehicles. One thing I can't forget, of course, is threat and air management when we talk about MPL. Threat and air management, in my opinion, is common sense. It's what we applied as pilots between an experienced first officer speaking to a captain. Have you ever flown to this destination we're going? No, I've never been to Moncton before. Well, fantastic. What are 3 things we need to identify and manage and mitigate in order to make this flight successful? This is absolutely relevant for RPAS, in my opinion, because you're facilitating, you're encouraging these pilots to think about planning for contingencies in advance, enhancing their situation awareness about fuel consumption, weather, which sitting in an office, in a nice comfortable office, you're totally removed from that environment. So by using and instilling threat and air management in your training programs in RPAS, I think you'll find some of those similarities will work quite well for you. The picture on the top right is actually the first graduating class of AirAsia MPL cadets that are now captains at AirAsia. So this proof and concept has over 3,500 different pilots in current training or that are graduates of MPL. And you can Google the MPL Global Tracker, and that'll show you a highlight or overview of the different programs that are out there. I'm sure I'm running over on time, so I'll try and summarize EBT in just a few minutes, which is an impossible task, but I'll do my best. EBT, for the most part, applies to recurrent training. So I talked to you about the pilot selection process. I talked to you about initial training, and now the recurrent training elements. EBT really had evolved the pilot competencies where we were stuck in a framework of, one could say, outdated evaluation standards where we were still checking the same elements that applied to aircraft systems that were two decades old, now don't necessarily apply in the modern sophisticated fly-by-wire aircraft that we operate today. So there's 2 elements to recurrent training for commercial aviation pilots, which is the license validation itself and then maneuvers validation. So we take the opportunity to tick the box to make sure that the license is renewed on the recurrent, and then the maneuver validation is where EBT expands and goes into the competency-based training framework. What it's done is it's taken the data, which pours in from the top for a LOSA, which is a line-oriented safety audit. It then puts into it the safety reports from the individual company or the operator, the flight data from the aircraft itself, and a training criticality survey, and then enters the system from there. This is really the design process where it begins and then cycles through the EBT recurrent development process. Similar to ATQP, you've got a 3-year cycle of systems that must be accomplished, but beyond that, as we've spoke about before in a competency-based training framework, it's all about practical application of what works for your organization. And EBT has done a fantastic job of looking at the environment, the operating equipment, and making it very practical to train resilient pilots in scenarios that are much more realistic. We would, at Etihad, we would go through different scenarios in EBT recurrent where we'd be managing weather into a short turn, which adds pressure, operational pressure. We would then also have to worry about our fuel consumption. So having the situational awareness and normal operational pressures that you'll have in a normal operation trains that resilience of pilots. The other big element, which has been touched on before from the other presenters, was the instructor train the trainer courses. It's extremely important that, as Ashley had mentioned, that the instructors also are trained and proficient with competency-based training programs. For RPAS, maybe this isn't as big of an obstacle, but where we had in commercial aviation training to overcome those 2 decades worth of training and checking, how were you on that day, that took a while for us to work beyond, and certainly robust train-the-trainer programs are very, very relevant for commercial aviation training. For RPAS, you don't have some of those bad habits, so maybe you can just implement a proper train-the-trainer course for your team. And then those are the pilot competencies. And as talked about before, I think every single one of those are relevant for RPAS. Every single one of those 8 competencies do apply when it comes to coordinating that sophisticated equipment that you're moving around the world. A couple takeaways I've got on the screen there for you. I also found it really interesting that we've never shared our presentations before this moment, and yet all of our presentations are saying the exact same thing, that competency-based training is customizable, it has to fit your operation, and that it's a slow gain towards proficiency. So thank you again for your time. If you have any questions, I look forward to answering them for you. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tim. And yes, I think it's important to say that training doesn't stop at the end of the training operator. And what is important also is that the competency framework do stay as a reference in the operational life, and that you can then come back on it and adapt it to your operational experience. So, I will not present myself, but I will try to wrap up and perhaps present a few ideas. I'm not a serious guy, so don't take them serious, on why to adopt a competency-based approach for remote pilots. And then I have to use the remote piloting station. So, I will try to define in a few questions our challenge, then what seems to me essential, and why a competency framework. So the challenge. Regulatory-wise, and even yesterday, we all understood that in the question of RPAS or UAS, whatever you call it, the regulatory framework will have to be operation-centric. There are a few reasons for that. One key reason is also that if you don't do it that way, it will be a nightmare, simply because the variety of missions, the variety of context, the variety of considerations are really important. RPAS configurations, they differ from each other. You can take off as a rocket fly as an aircraft, land as a balloon. It's the same RPAS. Don't categorize. You have the variety of operations, inspections, surveillance, even flying sometimes. Depending the use you make of your aircraft, the operations, the risks and mitigations, also responding to the context and the airspace you visit will differ. And not only the airspace, the area you fly over. Of course, this we did say yesterday that we had to insert that variety and that scalability, that complexity in the regulatory framework. But it's also true for the competencies. If we try to use an existing model, pilots or controllers, what do you use? It's very difficult to answer. I will not go in the details of it, but even the question of the level of automation can differ heavily from one RPAS to the other. And not only the level of automation in flying the aircraft, but also the level of automation of the mission by itself, the payload. Today we will discuss mostly remote pilot license. But you have an open question on the payload operator. Is it a different person? Shall it be a different person? Shall it be a competent person? Which competency? And so that variety of questions is also existing. Tomorrow, and most probably also Brent, in reading his bio, I understood he was working on UAS on airport environment. Makes total difference if it is a dedicated airport environment or what I called here on my slide a drone port. I don't know even if the word is existing in English, but you understand the concept. So that are the questions. What do we try to reach? For me, training is always the same purpose. It's make the professional not be comfortable, but at least exercise in a certain level of comfort in its everyday life. So training and competency framework is supporting the professional. And for me, the key questions are the level of automation, safety, the surrounding traffic, the airspace configuration, operational requirements. There, you didn't see how to fly the aircraft. This is not for me the essential question, because because a number of the features are done by the automat. So, who is our guy? A situation manager, a super pilot, a certified computer guy, then it's not me, or an alien. We have the habit to put a number of things and qualities on what we want to achieve at the end. But what I want, and why did I bring the alien question, is because we want it to be reachable. It cannot be a perfect guy on everything. It's not possible. It's a human. It's a human. So, what do I want? I want first, and perhaps my regulatory background, assure the safety of the airspace and assure the safety of the overflown people. What does it mean? Situation awareness. Also maintain the integrity of the system. That's a word we didn't pronounce yet, but for me it's key. You have an aircraft, a C2 link, a station. This is supposed to be a system, and it shall not go apart. Conduct the mission and communicate with the environment, and especially with the ATC, and manage unusual situations. This slide, except the remote pilot, I'm using it for 30 years to describe air traffic management and to describe the basic schemes of the airspace management. And it's still valid for the remote pilots. One of the big differences is that the aircraft is somewhere in the airspace and the pilot is somewhere on the ground. But the environment remains the same. So you have already understood one of the number of qualities of the competency-based framework, and I will not go back to the different details. What I want there is a word I want you to hear. It's taxonomy. In fact, in tuning the behaviors that you define in the details of your framework, you can express a level of expectation on the situation awareness or another competency, which is depending from your operation. This is really key. So, I am a training provider. How do I do? I have a profession, I have a framework, and then I have first to understand what are the key competencies I need, the various aspects I need to define, and transform them in training objectives. For that understanding, having a framework available that I react to is really an asset. Because believe me, if you do it with a white paper, it's difficult, really difficult. Then, as soon as I have it, my training objectives, I need to share them, I need to put it in my organizational context, and then I need to deliver the training. So, we will have to answer the question, most probably, is it a pilot, or is it a controller, or is it both of it? For me, it's more or less both of it, because you find a number of competencies which are appearing in all models: situation awareness, preparing the mission, conduct the flight, communicate, etc. You have it in both. But what is most important for me is really what comes first. And in my opinion, that's very personal, situation awareness comes first. The understanding of the environment. What comes second is the management of non-usual situation, especially the loss of the C2 link. That's my opinion. The rest will more or less, you will tune it easily. Or not easily, but in a similar manner where you have experience. So this is really important to answer those questions. What comes first? I will not go in the details. You will have them on the slides. But it's clear that, in my opinion, we are just at the beginning of the RPAS evolution. We don't really know if we will have those taxis that we were mentioning yesterday, what type of mission we will have to face. So another quality that the competency-based framework shall have is the capacity to adapt. And to adapt in a stable regulatory environment. And this is a quality of competency-based approach. Key competencies, more or less, they will remain the same. But then you can insert in your behaviors, in your detailed competencies, in your performance criteria, the feedback of the operations. And that's what I would like to have as a final word. If you work on competency-based framework, don't close it maintain it sufficiently open to make benefit of the operational experience. Thank you very much. So, Brent, you will have the pleasure to be the last presenter. So, Brent Terwillinger, I'm German speaker, so I pronounce it the German way, is Assistant Professor Aeronautics, Program Chair of the Master of Science on UAS in Embry-Riddle. But what I want to mention also, and I like that myself, is also research support of a program which is $1 million. It's, I wish we would have the same program in France, Muriel, on UAS at airports, dealing with UAS technology, small UAS training development, as well as situation awareness. This word is common to all presentations this morning. Brent, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here to discuss the use of competency-based training practices in the development and delivery of our recent small UAS training at Embry-Riddle Worldwide. Our entrance into S-UAS training started with unmanned systems-related research and educational development. Our examination indicated regulations and certification requirements between manned and unmanned vary drastically, especially between practical skills and assessment required in each area. The needs of this field are very diverse, from careers to jobs, as well as specific capabilities and experience required by employers. We gained further insight from the development and delivery of our various curriculum options, including our UAS minor, our unmanned systems degrees, and professional education programs. Our analysis has led us to ascertain there is a need for consistent, flexible training exceeding FAA Part 107 requirements in the United States. Students need opportunities to observe, learn, practice, apply, and refine critical knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs. Inclusion of real-world settings and scenarios help with employing the learn through doing philosophy, which is further enhanced through inclusion of activities featuring multiple applications, S-UAS, and support tools. Our primary motivation was to establish a path for our students to not only gain Part 107 certification, in addition to their academic education, but also develop practical application opportunities and experience using advanced concepts and best practices. Our S-UAS training design features a hybrid educational approach with asynchronous and synchronous elements to address unique aspects of distance and face-to-face learning. The program is structured in accordance with our online curriculum over 9-week terms. It's available to students across the United States who are geographically dispersed and experientially diverse in both the undergraduate and graduate levels. In support of our development, we derived a series of KSAs relative to roles within typical operations and aligned to common aviation practices. From these KSAs, we identified applicable learning outcomes, objectives, activities, and finally assessments for use in the curriculum. It was also necessary to identify consistent, reliable, and appropriate tools while soliciting feedback and guidance from the industry to ensure optimal alignment. Our design introduces students to a variety of platforms and tasks to assist them in achieving mastery above minimum requirements of certification. This is also in line with industry expectations to ensure competitive standing and proficiency. This includes exposure to multi-rotor and fixed-wing S-UAS, as well as development of flight operations experience based on institutional subject matter expertise. That connects into that local development that was referred to earlier. We found it essential to provide students with incremental exposure, progression, and assessment, featuring instructor-guided feedback and practice throughout the program. And you'll hear me refer to that over and over throughout my discussion here. This graphic represents an overview of our S-UAS training strategy. First, our students start with an introduction and exploration of operational fundamentals, which leads to higher order academic research pursuits and preparation for the FAA Remote Pilot Certification Examination. They then progress to building hands-on operational KSAs and experience under the guidance of an instructor in a practical application and assessment environment. The program moves on to coverage of advanced flight planning, risk assessment, and safety management concepts to develop detailed operational plans for a number of environments, platforms, and situations. The program features student development and defense of a proposed operational plan, which is presented to an internal safety review board for evaluation. The culmination of this effort prepares the student to enter the field with both practical experience as well as knowledge and abilities that are in line with competitive employer expectations and with an academic degree. The first component of our three-part strategy is S-UAS Operational Fundamentals, which is comparable to conventional manned flight ground school, with the addition of UAS-specific information and academic elements such as research. In this sequence, students are expected to demonstrate appropriate acquisition and recall of knowledge, which assists in preparation for their certification exams. And it also supports gaining a comprehensive understanding of key factors supporting productive, purposeful, responsible, and legal operation of an S-UAS, a concept that will be repeated and built upon throughout the program. Next is the S-UAS Practical Application and Assessment, which features simulated and actual flight operations. This segment prepares students to safely and effectively operate S-UAS by establishing and improving unmanned airmanship skills through incremental progression combined with instructor-guided assessment, feedback, and assigned practice activities. Students gain further experience with key factors supporting that productive, purposeful, responsible, and legal operation. This graphic depicts the details of the practical application and assessment process. This is essentially the core of our flight training. It features simulated and actual flight operations. Students progress through a series of activities under the guidance and review of an instructor. Each task set represents a logical gate and proficiency check that builds on the previous, culminating in a final assessment or check ride type evaluation. Each element, from basic to advanced maneuvers, features opportunity for practice and instructor reassessment. The final component of our program is operational planning and safety management. It builds on those previously attained KSAs through use of S-UAS planning and management concepts to develop further operational exposure and experience. It is at this stage that students master key factors supporting that productive, purposeful, responsible, and legal operation. It extends beyond training scenarios to include real-world applications and operations, encompassing critical concepts and topics necessary to analyze, plan, and effectively operate in the field. We utilize a number of tools in our training program. First, simulation to support exhibition, practice, and assessment combined with interactive scenarios. The two primary simulation tools we use at the moment include our Aerial Robotics Virtual Lab, or ARVL, which was developed in partnership with Pinnacle Solutions. ARVL provides students with the ability to examine individual components, assemble a UAS design, and see operational capabilities, and then plan and conduct remote operations. Next, we use Real Flight RC Simulator, a commercial off-the-shelf tool, which is used to learn and practice basic to advanced maneuvers, improve proficiency, and gain exposure to a wider variety of S-UAS configurations and environments, all within a highly controlled and safe setting. We also require students to purchase an S-UAS toolkit. This contains the specific tools and equipment that they will use in the conduct of their training, as well as later in research and professional operations. Our training also relies on use of university-owned assets, including additional platforms such as the Parrot Disco fixed wing and DJI Inspire. Additionally, we incorporate our educational framework within a learning management system, in our case Canvas, for online educational delivery. We integrate applicable text materials into the course, in addition to multimedia, peer-reviewed literature, and government or industry reports. So this is the big thing. Our major observations and challenges from development and delivery, they include the need to quickly adapt and revise materials based on a rapidly changing landscape. This includes regulations, dynamic field and industry needs, and internal opportunities for improvement. Anyone can legally fly S-UAS in the United States without any practical experience, which has several major implications. First, there are significant differences in training between manned aircraft and S-UAS. That includes operational requirements, capabilities, and perspectives that require sufficient coverage and exposure. In the US, we only require a knowledge exam for certification. There's no demonstration of proficiency required. In addition, serving as an RPC instructor does not require a specific certification, as it does with manned training. These all represent factors that can influence how training is potentially provided to students. The experience and skills of conventionally trained manned pilots versus non-pilots also plays an important part of both delivery and design. Non-pilots are able to adapt quickly, especially to nose-in, translational, and exocentric perspective experience. However, they often lack contextual understanding of regulations, best practices, and aviation safety culture. Alternatively, experienced manned pilots present us with the inverse. While lacking exocentric perspective, they do understand those critical concepts from the aviation environment. What we found that requires is increasing the number of exposure and specific activities tied to that exocentric operation. Another significant challenge is overcoming the "I already know all of this" mindset, from hobbyist to DoD level UAS pilot. This mindset represents a challenge not only with UAS and RPAS, but really all aircraft and aviation training. There's almost always room to grow and learn new methods. The issue can be overcome by encouraging students to keep an open mind and explore specifics of the software, system, and use. Finally, translation from online to a real-world setting requires forethought and consideration. For example, appropriate training site selection, in Class G airspace, away from bystanders and visual line of sight impediments, and inclement weather requires close attention and instructor confirmation. Rigorous instructor assessment and feedback, in combination with progression gates, can prevent unprepared operation, while highlighting areas requiring further attention and practice. And for students who are already Part 107 certified, there's no legal recourse to their advancing independently. However, we address it through instructor and safety review board oversight of their proposed activities in connection to the academic components. So in closing, our entrance into S-UAS training represents an exciting opportunity for our institutions, students, and partners. Competency-based training provides a highly effective method to improve student preparation and experience to contribute to the success of this field. By working together to examine successes as well as challenges, we can collectively improve opportunities for the future workforce and support productive, purposeful, responsible, and legal operations across our global setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Now has come the question and answer session, and we will defer the coffee for 1 hour. No. But I think I have three hypotheses. I don't have many questions. Either you were asleep, or you did understand everything, or you really want your coffee. So I will ask the first one, I think, which is a very interesting question, and then we'll see how we manage the time. I read it. ATC units, operators and training providers had many years of experience and data on which to base their decisions on what competencies and observable behaviors are necessary when building competency-based training and assessment. You see the question coming. Given that there is not the same amount of data and experience available regarding RPAS operations, does the panel feel that it is possible to define relevant, repeatable criteria? Who takes it? Be competent with the mic.
Hello?
Yeah, it works.
Good. So I'll give you a typical ICAO answer. Yes and no is the answer. I'm going with our experience in the RPAS panel when we were working on developing the competency framework for the remote pilot. There's not a whole lot of, well, I won't say this because you'll hear an operator speaking in the following session who's got a long experience operating drones, an RPAS. So perhaps they have a different view on this. But when we were developing the competency framework, we were trying to figure out, okay, which competencies can we use, can we start with that we already have that would make sense for the remote pilots. So we looked at the ones we had for the pilots and those that we had for ATC, for the controllers. And we came to the conclusion for that first version of the ICAO competency framework for the RPL that maybe it was a combination of both. So we do have a sense of what the competencies could be, should be for now, but I'm sure that there will be some adjustments that will have to be made as we get to know more about the variety of operations, the way these things work, and that the competency framework, the ICAO competency framework, will evolve. But that's true of all the ICAO competency framework for all the different disciplines. So,
thank you.
An attempt at an end.
Brent?
So I'm going to build on my, role as a professor here and just provide some context. RPAS UAS technology, it's not new. It's actually older than manned aviation. We saw this technology developed as test beds that proved out the feasibility and evolution of manned aviation. We've seen what we know as the modern day UAS rise in prominence due to MEMS sensors and other micro-miniaturization. And now we have the ubiquitous nature of this technology, but we've long used it in research and military environments. So we have that to look for. We have that to go off of. We're not starting from complete scratch with this technology. We have a lot of proficiency and knowledge built up from manned aviation that does transfer over. So it's not an alien technology. It's not a brand new concept. We have plenty to build on. So.
Yes, Ashley?
I think to add to that, although it is not necessarily a new technology, I think what is evolving is the way in which we use the technology. So I think that this is where the approach that ICAO has taken makes a lot of sense, because although there has been the effort to identify what is likely to be the most appropriate competencies, it's an adaptable model. You have the possibility as we learn more to adapt those competencies, to add competencies.
like to say myself is that you have the same challenge with the regulatory framework. Looking at the regulatory framework, you assume what is essential, what you have to deal with, and a number of features. So you have to define a sort of smart regulation that will be capable to adapt to the real life. But it doesn't mean that you cannot take any decision, and it's the same for the competency-based framework. So, with that, I have another one, but I send it on the floor, and I promise that we will deal with it during the day, because, in my opinion, it's not totally linked to competency-based framework. The question is, how do you become an ICAO-approved training provider? So I leave it in your brains, and we try to answer that question during the day, but it's not CBT related. With that, I'd like to conclude this session and thank all our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farid, and thank you to the panelists. Some of you will be back for the next session, so we'll see your faces again up here. For everybody else, we have coffee serving outside the assembly hall. You're welcome to go get some caffeine into you to help continue the waking up process and to sit through the next session. Coffee is sponsored by IATA. Thank you very much, IATA.